What we're trying to do in this session is look at existential themes, both in the Haggadah and in the Seder and in Pesach in general. Try and focus especially on words, on certain words that are used, what they mean, and how we can convert them into questions that are important for us in the lives we're living today. Because I'm not particularly interested in Judaism as a history lesson, as a museum, which you stick under glass and then you forget about it. I'm interested in what we can do with ancient material and convert it into material that works for us as we move through our challenges today. And with no further ado, let's look at the very first source, which is the word Egypt. The word Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim, and because Hebrew cognates and English cognates are so different, the word in Hebrew means something completely different than it does in English. In Hebrew, it comes from the word tsar. That's the middle of the word, Mitzrayim, Tzadi Resh in Hebrew. Tsar means narrow. It means a narrow path. It means to be constricted. It means to be living in a really hemmed in place. There are verses that we have in Jewish liturgy, very famous one, Min HaMeitzar, Karatiyah, from a very narrow place I called out to you, God. That's what Mitzrayim is. So that's what Mitzrayim was obviously in antiquity, where human life was meaningless, where people were treated like objects. But each person, every Pesach, has to review for themselves what sort of narrow place they're in now, where they feel hemmed in, where they feel stuck. And it's actually best to do this in a kind of organized, itemized way. So one of the things you can do, either before the Seder, during the Seder, after the Seder, is to actually record for yourself. Just ask yourself questions like, how do I feel hemmed in? Where did I feel freer last year? And something has happened to me in the ensuing 12 months that makes me feel more stuck today. That is your Egypt, right? And if the goal of the Exodus is to quote unquote come out of Egypt, so that's what you're doing. That's what each individual person at the Seder is attempting to do for themselves. They're attempting to come out of their Egypt, and nobody can tell you what that is for you. So the importance about communal events, which is to commune around a certain piece of text or a certain set of rituals, is it's fun to do the rituals and it's nice to read the text, but the really important part is to be able to connect that to what is actually going on for you. So when you read about the Israelites leaving Egypt, the point is to think about the Egypt that you're trying to leave as well, because obviously the ancient Egypt, as we see in source 2, as Martin Buber says, Egypt ascribed no greater value to the foot of the living human being than to the water wheel which that foot turned. You know, like whether it was your body or an object, for the Egyptians, it was all the same. Somewhere around the middle of the Seder, meaning the middle of the Haggadah, not that far, not that long before you will actually wash your hands and say the blessing for the matzah, you're going to read what is really one of the core sentences of the Haggadah. And that sentence is, in every generation, a person is obliged to see oneself, in Hebrew, li'ot et atzmo, as if one had come out of the land of Egypt. Now, when you read that sentence, you can kind of get a brain freeze. You can say to yourself, okay, it's asking me to feel as if I came out of Egypt. But the thing of it is I didn't come out of Egypt, right? The thing of it is like, that was like a long time ago and they were slaves and I'm not a slave and I don't live in Egypt. So this is a meaningless sentence. So it's actually very interesting that the medieval philosopher Maimonides kind of picked up on that, picked on the idea that if you read it literally, it's going to feel irrelevant. It's going to feel like it's stuck in antiquity. So look at the change he makes in his laws of chametz and matzah. In source 3, line 2, he says, in each and every generation, a person must not see yourself, but demonstrate yourself. Laharot, which is the reflexive form of the verb to see. It's not to see oneself, but to show yourself, right? You have to show yourself as if you yourself, and then he adds one other word, ata, with an ayin, that now you've left the slavery in Egypt. So see what Maimonides did there? He contemporized the whole situation, right? You've got the sentence in the Haggadah, and it's like blah, blah, blah. Like you got to think of yourself as like you're actually coming out of Egypt, and like it's also very cute, but like there's no way. But with just those few little changes, it becomes personal. In each generation, a person has to show themselves now how you're going to get out of the slavery of Egypt, meaning your slavery, your Egypt, your Mitzrayim. So that's the first, and that's the macro goal of the Seder and of the entire holiday of Passover. So whether you get to it on the Seder night or you do it throughout the holiday, Jewish holidays have tasks, right? They give us work to do, right? And that work is spiritual work. And that work is different in each holiday. So the work of Rosh Hashanah is actually values prioritization. What do I want to do with my life? What is the new year for me? The values work of Yom Kippur is, how do I gain forgiveness from the people I've hurt? How do I, approach somebody and say that they hurt me? So that's a lot of atonement work, and that's really hard, difficult work, right? The work of Passover is to think about you in terms of your own liberation or lack of it. How did you get into this spot? What can free you? What steps would you need to take? What's the next thing you need to do tomorrow, right? So that's the macro goal. One of the ways we begin to break down the macro goal is to think about what sorts of things in modernity actually do a bit of the constricting, a bit of the, so to speak, enslaving. That leads us to another very important word. It's the word in source 4. It's also in the Haggadah, but it's taken from the book of Exodus very early in chapter 1. The Egyptians made the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, serve with rigor, befarach. Befarach is a hard word to translate. And if you're reading it in the English, it'll say things like hard labor or rigor or backbreaking work, like everybody's kind of searching for the right translation. I'm just going to give you 2 interpretations in Jewish thought about what it means to serve with befarach. One is the Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir, who lives in the 12th century and is actually the grandson of one of the great Jewish commentators, Rashi. He says it's an expression, this is in source 4, related to breaking something. The treatment of the Israelites was intended to break them mentally and physically. So this is when you do work that actually leaves you a little broken. It gets at some part of you and kind of shatters it. Could be mental, could be physical. Then there's a kind of emotional, spiritual side that is referred to in really a lovely interpretation in source 5 by the Ben Ish Chai, who was the Chacham, the sort of chief wisdom person in Baghdad in Iraq in the 19th century. Look what he writes, very, very contemporary. He says, doing meaningless work. This isn't necessarily like hard in terms of physical labor, but it's hard in terms of its futility. Doing meaningless work, such as building a falling edifice, is the ultimate hard labor, right? You're building something that's basically geared to collapse. In other words, all of your efforts are going to be for naught. It's like there was a play by Martin Sherman called Bent, where the prisoners took a brick, moved it to the other side, then picked it up and moved it back, right? That's befarach. So the example he gives at the end of source 5 is if you're told to draw water from the river and then pour it back, the labor will be 1,000 times more difficult. So again, cueing into the language of the Haggadah in terms of our lives, everybody should think when they get to that word, and a good idea would be to write the word down before you start the Seder so that you'll be cued to it when you get to that word. What in my life am I doing that is not meaningful? I'm putting a lot of energy into it, a lot of work, a lot of conversation, possibly even a lot of my money. And it's actually meaningless. It's not getting me anywhere. I'm just spinning my wheels. May not even be physically taxing, but emotionally and mentally, it's draining the life out of you. That is what the Haggadah wants you to think about when it introduces this word. And partly what it means to be free then is to take complete responsibility for our lives and understand that if we want to be free, it's up to us to achieve that state, that nobody can liberate us from the outside on a certain deep level. Irvin Yalom, the professor emeritus of psychiatry at Stanford and really an amazing author, in a book called Existential Psychotherapy, which is now in its 5th decade, writes the following in 6. The human being is not only free, but is doomed to freedom. And I think this is a brilliant insight, right? Freedom has terrifying implications. It means beneath us, there is no ground. A key existential dynamic is the clash between our confrontation with groundlessness and our wish for ground and structure. Let's just talk about that for a little bit, right? Everybody talks about wanting to be free, wanting to be liberated, want to be autonomous, and yet secretly we're terrified of it. Why are we terrified of freedom? Because it means my life is really mine. Like, it's my choices, it's my decisions, it's my consequences. I can't blame anybody else. I can't look beneath my feet for some sort of support net. It's my life. And even though we say we want it, and many times we don't really want it, because real responsibility is actually very scary. Because we're used to, from the time we're little, in many ways, if something doesn't go right, we can say, oh, it's their fault. My parents, my teachers, my siblings, my friends, my lovers, my spouse, my children, my boss, right? It's always externalized. But what Yalom is telling us in the last 3 lines of the page is that to be aware of responsibility is to be aware of creating your own self, your own destiny, your own life predicament, your own feelings, and if such is the case, one's own suffering. And that's why freedom is much harder than it seems. And that's why in some ways, we don't really take advantage of it. We don't really grab freedom. And just before I stop for questions, that's the point made by the great American writer James Baldwin in Source 7, when he says freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take. And look what he says now. People are as free as they want to be. People are as free as they want to be. One has not got to have an enormous military machine in order to be unfree. When it's simpler to be asleep, simpler to be apathetic, simpler, in fact, not to want to be free, to think that something else is more important. And you think, but that's not true. Of course we want to be free. But again, what Baldwin is saying is that real freedom means real responsibility. It means taking the pain of saying it was my choices that got me here, and it'll be my choices that get me unstuck. And so in the end, we really have to identify who we are. As Rav Soloveitchik points out in Source 8, there's 2 ways to talk about slavery. One is from the Haggadah. We were slaves to Pharaoh. That phrase means, I'm my own person, I just happen to be a slave at the moment, and Pharaoh is my master. But the second way, which is more troubling in fact, is the way Abraham's slave or servant talks about it in Genesis, where he says, a slave to Abraham am I. Like literally, it's not just what I do, it's who I am. So is servitude or bondage or constraint or restriction or whatever word you want to use about what's troubling you, is that an accident? Is that just something incidental that's happened and you're going to get out of it? Or is it a way that we've actually narrated our life to ourselves? And we actually have to start telling ourselves a completely new story if we want to get free. Let's summarize and move forward. Okay, so what I've said is that the Seder and the Haggadah actually have code words, keywords that cue you into your life, your existential situation at any time. The Haggadah is deeply interested in notions of freedom, which entail notions of responsibility and actually non-blame, and saying it is my life and therefore it is my responsibility, because ultimately that's what freedom means. Freedom in Western discourse often turns into a synonym for just license. I can do whatever the heck I want. That's not what freedom means Jewishly. Freedom Jewishly is more of an existential concept of ultimate responsibility for myself. I am free to make my life, which means I'm also, that with that freedom comes total responsibility for what I've done. The Haggadah also begins to teach you on the fly how to achieve some of that agency, right? So some of the steps, right? There are 15 steps. Some of the steps are actually little ritualistic playing out of learning to be free, right? So let's talk about one of those things, which is called yachatz, all right? And everybody kind of has that song in their head when they get to the Seder of, Kadesh, Urchatz, right? It's the fourth one, right? Kadesh is to say Kiddush, Urchatz is to wash your hands for the karpas, the green vegetable, which is a replaying of something they used to do in temple times, which is for reasons of ritual purity, they'd wash their hands before they ate certain kinds of vegetables. Okay, so when you get through that, you come to what is really, in my opinion, the first really fascinating moment of the evening, which is yachatz. Yachatz comes from the word chetzi, which means half. And all of you will recall that you take the middle matzah in Ashkenaz, and many Sephardim only have two matzot, so it's the bottom one, but the middle matzah, and you break it, and the larger portion you put off for the afikoman, right, which gets hidden, and the other portion gets stuck back into the cover to be eaten when you do the ritual of actually eating matzah later in the evening. Okay. What have you done here? You've done one of the most essential gestures of humanity since, the days of creating fire, which is you've broken bread, literally and metaphorically. You've broken bread, and you have to think about why do we break bread, right? So I haven't included it here, but a tragic metaphor for breaking bread is, why do you take something that's whole and break it? So one reason would be because you want to put it away for later. And why do you want to put it away for later? Because you don't have enough to eat. So if you read Primo Levi's Auschwitz memoir, Survival in Auschwitz, he talks about the fact that what they would do with their incredibly minuscule bread ration, right, probably like a breadcrumb, is there was an argument in the camps about whether you eat it all right away, but then there's nothing left for the rest of the day, or you basically do yachatz, right, which is that you split this terribly small ration in two, because psychologically the notion that there's more coming later is helpful to you, except the problem is that it could get lost, it could get stolen, and so on. There's an incredibly poignant line in the memoir where he says the only defense against theft is having it in your stomach. So that's one metaphor for yachatz, right? And that's, if you think about what you're eating, when you do yachatz, it says this is the bread of oni, of affliction, right? So the bread of affliction in this modality is because you're breaking it because you don't have enough, right? But we know there's a really rich set of metaphors that's exactly the opposite. That's what's so cool about yachatz, is that it has these differing ways of thinking about it. And the other set of metaphors is that you break bread to share, right? And sharing is a sign of bounty. Sharing is a sign of communion. Sharing is a sign of humanity. So there's a lovely Haggadah. It's just called Haggadah. It's got a white cover by Mark Ella Wakanin, who's a professor of comparative literature, both in Paris and in Israel. And in the section of Yachatz, in his Haggadah, in source 9, it says, the gesture of breaking bread is one of the most essential gestures of Judaism. What does this gesture mean? That a person is always engaged in a relationship with another human being. To be is to be with. The Talmud asks, who is rich? Right? There's a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, Ezeu Ashir, who is rich? Hasameach bechalko, and that's usually translated the person who's happy with their chelek, with their portion, meaning they appreciate what they have. But he does a little twist on it, and he says another one is Hasameach bechalko, the one who's happy in the sharing. Right? It's beautiful interpretation. So the idea here would be that yachatz is teaching you freedom. How is it teaching you freedom? Freedom is achieved by breaking narcissism. That's one of the ways you get free, right? Because all of us are stuck in a kind of narcissistic loop where we're constantly thinking about me, 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 me. So yachatz acts out the breaking of the narcissistic loop by breaking the matzah, sharing it, putting it away in the afikoman, putting it away to be eaten later. And of course, it's not the actual yachatz that's going to change your life, but it's there as a signal to say, how much have I shared with people? How would sharing, how would communing, how would helping, how would outer directedness be a really important component of my freedom? And there's a lovely parallel explanation in really a wonderful Haggadah called the Chief Rabbi's Haggadah from the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was the Chief Rabbi of England. Haggadah is almost 20 years old now. This is his take on Yachatz in source 10. Right? He says, this is a strange invitation, right? And he quotes from the Haggadah. This is the bread of oppression, the poor man's bread. Our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come in and eat. He asks a really great question. What hospitality is it to offer the hungry the taste of suffering? Like, why are you offering this like stale, hard, dry bread? Like, that doesn't seem very hospitable. He says, in fact, though, there's a profound insight into the nature of slavery and freedom. Matzah represents two things. It's the food of slaves, but it's also the bread eaten by the Israelites as they leave Egypt in liberty. So it's got this double symbology, matzah. It was this food that slaves ate, but it's also the food that people who are about to be liberated eat. So how do you reconcile those two things? So he says, what transforms the bread of oppression into the bread of freedom is the willingness to share it with others. In fact, he says, sharing food, sharing anything really, is the first act through which slaves become free human beings, right? Because you now have agency over your stuff. Like only somebody who has agency over their stuff can actually share it. You can't share other people's stuff that doesn't belong to you. Right? So he says, one who is willing to divide his food with a stranger has already shown himself to be capable of fellowship and faith, the two things from which hope is born. That's why we begin the Seder by inviting others to join us. Bread shared is no longer the bread of oppression. And that's how he says how you bring freedom into the world. So obviously, I think a key thing with Yachatz is to do Yachatz before the Seder, right? Even though that's counterintuitive, right? But in other words, you begin to think about the idea of the sentence you're going to say. So think about it now, right? Like think about it because we're T-minus 2 weeks till the Seder. Who can I invite? Who can come to me, right? And I want to really stress this even more than I usually do. I've noticed during COVID a very thin line. And the thin line is between necessary precautions about people's health and paranoia about being with other people, right? So I'm not telling anybody here to compromise their health, but I am saying that maybe we're sometimes a little bit too strict with who we let into our life and who we might invite to our seders. And maybe you can socially distance and maybe you can wear a mask and however you're going to do it, but there are lonely people out there. There are people who it's the high point of their year to get invited to somebody's Seder, to begin to feel a bit of agency in their life, a bit of communion, a bit of fellowship. So I think we need to do Yachatz before the Yachatz and think very, very carefully about who's going to be around, who can I help out, even if it's, obviously in certain constrained circumstances, given the pandemic. Baldwin is obviously one of the remarkable figures in 20th century literature. I wonder if we realize just how stunning the thing he said really is. We spend so much time thinking about oppression in macro terms, and that's all too that's sensible, right? Especially we see what's going on in the Ukraine and elsewhere, so we understand that like there's tremendous macro oppression, but it doesn't need to be large and dramatic, he's saying. Like when you just feel just a little bit lazy, a little bit apathetic, path of least resistance, all of that stuff erodes, breaks down your freedom. And what Baldwin points out then is that this erosion of our freedom is happening every day, at every moment. And I think that we thought that freedom was just, like vacation, And if you think about the word vacation, right, which comes from the Latin to vacate, which means to empty out, I think that's what we thought it was going to be. It was just going to be like breezy, Freedom's not breezy. Freedom's like work every day to hang on to your sense of self and to hang on to the fact that it is my life and I'm responsible for it. And I think that's what Baldwin really is the kind of work that we need to do. So I said before, I'm going to say it again, that at each step, there are little cues and helpers to think about our agency. So I've pointed out yachatz, the breaking of the matzah, at sort of the kind of climactic part of the first half of the Seder, when everybody's like grumbling to eat. So you have this quick succession of ritual, right? And the succession is basically eating the matzah, then eating the maror, and then eating the matzah and the maror together. And when you think about it, you think matzah, oh, that's the bread of liberation, and maror, that's the bitter herbs, that's the bitterness, that's not freedom, right? So it's very interesting to see in Hasidic thought that actually the maror, the bitterness, the pain, the challenges you go through is the very essence, epitome. It's a crucial step in feeling free. Why? So let's start with source 11. Here he's talking about the sequence of matzah and maror, which if you think about it, should be in the reverse, right? This is a very good question. Rav Simcha Bunim Pesishka, one of the great 19th century masters of Chassidut, says, don't we have it backwards? Shouldn't it be maror and then matzah? And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. You go through 400 years of slavery, that's the maror, right? Then you come out of Egypt, that's the matzah. Why at our Seders do we first eat matzah and then eat maror? Doesn't make sense. So he says, and it's a very deep thing, he says, as long as there was no prospect of being delivered, the Israelites didn't feel the bitterness of the experience keenly. As soon as Moses spoke to them of freedom, they awoke to the bitterness of their slavery. Let's all think about our lives here, because it's a very profound thing. If you get into a certain point of your life, it's really a hard place to be in, right? It's a place of depression and a place of real resignation, I would say, despondency. You're even beyond pain at that point. It's just feeling stuck and numbness maybe is the right word. So what Reb Simcha Bunim is saying is that you don't even realize the maror until you eat the matzah, right? You get a little taste of an opening, and then your pain rushes in, right? It's like if you think about somebody who has cut themselves off emotionally, right? There's actually a wonderful movie about this called Shadowlands, which is a biopic about C.S. Lewis, the English writer, who basically lost his mother at a young age and really cut himself off emotionally. He didn't have, he was this big intellectual at Oxford, and he's world renowned for his poetry. He wrote Narnia. Didn't have any romantic relationships. And the movie traces how once he falls in love late, like in his 50s, he forms a deep attachment. And then his partner, and then his wife develops cancer and she dies. And the pain is overwhelming. And the pain is overwhelming because he's tasted the matzah. He's had a little bit of space now to really feel what it is to feel free. And then when you eat the maror, you recognize what it was to be without it, right? So when you eat the matzah, says Rav Simcha Bunim, and you get a taste of what freedom is, and then you get the maror and you realize I've been without it for so long. I've been without good things. I haven't nurtured myself. I haven't taken care of myself. That's when you really appreciate both of them. So it's a fantastic insight about the sequence. And it makes us think about the sequencing of our lives, about what we cut ourselves off from, right? The movie is called Shadowlands, right? It was directed by one of the Attenboroughs. I don't remember David or Richard. And it stars Deborah Winger and Anthony Hopkins. And it's a real tearjerker, I warn you. So another take on it, though, is from the Chidushei HaRim, quoted by his grandson, the Sfat Emet, who just asked, like, why do we eat maror at all? This is source 12. He answered, feeling pain, the bitterness, is actually a sign of redemption. Just feeling the bitterness in itself is the first glimmer of freedom. The worst kind of slavery is when we grow so accustomed to it that we accommodate ourselves to it. And that's similar to source 11. That's a super important thing to ask yourself, right? Are there things that I've just sort of gotten used to, that I accept, that I've resigned myself to, and I shouldn't, right? I've just allowed this to be. And as the Sfat Emet tells us here, it's actually sometimes a good thing to feel that twinge, that wince, that pain of like, I'm alive, like this isn't good. I need to do something, right? Because maybe the worst feeling is that feeling of numbness because you lose all your agency. You're not doing anything about it. So again, here, to get back to our theme here, right? The steps of the Seder are there to give you emotional insight into ways of getting ourselves free. I think many times people read the Haggadah, people's Seders in a way are a bifurcated experience, I think. Many Seders I've been to are, we had fun, the family was there, we were there, we sang the songs and we did the plagues and, the 4 questions, and it was kind of fun. And then we ate and it was like, nice. But if you actually ask them, what did you get out of the Haggadah this year? What did you learn in the story? What did you think of that section? It actually becomes much murkier, much blurrier. People actually look at the Haggadah and they think, it's kind of like a weird text in a way. It's got all these like weird rabbinic things going on and but we like it anyway. In other words, their attitude to the Haggadah is like in spite of, rather than because of. Right? What I'm trying to tell you is like, it's because of. Right? The Haggadah is actually giving you tremendous emotional tools to think about how we live and how we could live better. So that's matzah and that's maror. I want to focus now on really, really contemporary ways that have created servitude. And this gets into more of a cultural analysis of the kinds of things that are going on, especially in the West, that are leaving a lot of people very frustrated, feeling like they lack, feeling like they're not good enough. And this is a culture of comparison that was begun by advertising and has become maximized by social media. I want to show you a startling thing that was said almost a century ago, 95 years ago, by Paul Mazur, who was a Wall Street banker working for Lehman Brothers at the time. And this is how far back this consciousness in the modern West goes. He says in source 13, we must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire. I find that so chilling. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs, right? There's a whole history that follows that of creating false needs for people that they can never, ever, ever fulfill. It is not the time and place to talk about this in detail, but I wonder if everybody recognizes the amount of time, energy, and focus that corporations put into seducing you, making you feel like you don't have enough, making you want to buy, right? Here's one small example from the American thinker Matthew Crawford from a terrific book called The World Beyond Your Head. In source 14, Crawford writes, in Seoul, South Korea, a smell resembling that of Dunkin' Donuts coffee is released into the ventilation system as a Dunkin' Donuts advertisement plays over the bus sound system. Shortly before, the bus stops outside a Dunkin' Donuts store. right? So they're like releasing scent into the bus to attract your pheromones to get you off the bus. You know, you smell it, you see the Dunkin' Donut store, you get off the bus, like before your stop, right? Right, that's advertising at work. What we're all finding is that there are fewer and fewer spaces that we can feel like we're just with ourselves and we're not being messaged and messaged and messaged. And that's the point that Crawford makes next. And this is a deep form of contemporary slavery. He says the ever more complete penetration of public spaces by attention-getting technologies exploits the orienting response of humans in a way that preempts sociability, directing us away from one another and toward a manufactured reality. I know that's a dense sentence. Just stay on it, and I'm going to give you a perfect example. You get on an elevator with somebody else, right? Now, when people get on elevators, you know, they can either smile awkwardly or not pay attention to each other, and they might start talking. But in modern elevators, like corporate office building elevators, when you get in the elevator, there are screens, there's music, there's data flashing across the screen. That's what he means. You go into a hotel lobby, same thing. You go into a public space, same thing. Okay, that's what he means. Let's read the sentence again. The penetration of public spaces by attention-getting technologies, which takes your response away from each other, right? Preempts sociability toward a manufactured reality. And here's the kicker, the content of which is determined from afar by private parties that have a material interest in doing so. In other words, some far-off corporation stuck that into the elevator. Now nobody's talking to each other, right? This is just one tiny example of a much larger phenomenon of how social capital has been eroded, and we're not in communication. That's one problem. So there's an irony here. The irony is, on the one hand, we're not communicating enough to each other. And the other hand, we're communicating too much. But the too much that we're communicating is not actual intimacy. It's just messaging. It's just constant texting and WhatsApping and Instagramming. So he says the valuable thing we take for granted is the condition of not being addressed. When I read that line, it changed my life, okay? The condition of not being addressed. What he's talking about is that an essential part of contemporary freedom is to set boundaries, is to say to yourself, I do not have to respond, right? Because we've created a culture where you feel pushed to respond constantly. Somebody sends you a text. Have you ever had this experience? Somebody sends you a text and then you didn't respond in 10 minutes and I send you another text. Why didn't you respond, right? On some level, that's just incredible chutzpah. Like, am I at your beck and call that everything you send me I have to respond to immediately? But that's the vibe that we've gotten into. So what Crawford is talking about is create an ethos for yourself. I have the right not to respond, right? I have the right of not being addressed. And that, I think, will change our lives, right? If we can just begin to not revolutionize everything, but just sort of expand the space that's mine in terms of not just space, but time. I'm not going to answer you this morning. Maybe later today, maybe tomorrow. Why? Because I have a right not to be addressed, because I have a right to do other things that I deem to be more important, right? So what we want to think about also on Pesach is the way I live being subtly or not even subtly influenced by other people's expectations, other people's needs, other people's demands, including the demand to be responded to instantly, right? And that's just a contemporary example of a kind of age-old phenomenon, right? And of course, as you know, as Jeremy Benstein points out in Source 15, that's how advertising makes its money, right? It cultivates covetousness, right? It makes you, I mean, he says it very simply in the fourth line, advertising deals in dissatisfaction. If you're happy, you don't feel like you need to buy more stuff, you know, but if you're unhappy, like, I need something to make me, you know, richer, faster, smarter, more powerful, sexier, whatever it is, I'm not enough. I'm never enough. And that is a real huge problem. And, you know, we know for sure that this is being accelerated in social media, where there's a lot of social comparison going on. You can check out a study that was done in source 16. When you're looking at other people's lives and the lives seem better than yours, so that's a problem. So all of this are just like sorts of things about the ways our freedom is being a little bit kind of imposed on, and what we need to do in a way to address that. And last thing in the section I want to point out is another line that I read many years ago that was very impactful for me in source 19, which is Stephen Batchelor, the great contemporary Buddhist scholar, in his book Alone with Others. However hard we try, we'll never succeed in filling an inner emptiness from the outside. It can only be filled from within. A lack of being remains unaffected by a plenitude of having. So buying won't get it done. Consumption won't get it done. We have to identify, and that's painful, but we have to do it. We have to identify what feels emptier inside and start the process of filling that from the inside out, whatever we need to do that. So all of these are things that we kind of address at the time of Pesach. And the process of this spiritual kind of cleansing, identifying our needs and fulfilling them actually begins before Pesach. It begins in the whole process of the cleaning out and the metaphor of the cleaning out of your space right through into the Haggadah and the Seder and into the rest of the holiday. So without getting into the nitty gritty of what we do with our chametz, we all know that there's a process in which people get rid of all of their leavened products. Certain situations, one can sell it, but the physical labor is basically cleaning your space. And then the night before Passover, you do a verbal nullification. You say, whatever is chametz in my domain, whether I know it or I don't know it, I'm aware of it or not, I hereby proclaim that it's not mine. I consider it ownerless. Some of you might even remember the formula, like dust of the earth. It doesn't belong to me. And by doing that, we sort of say, maybe I forgot, maybe there's a piece of bread in the drawer somewhere. It doesn't matter, it's not mine. Right? And then that's it. That is actually a physical procedure that has a spiritual parallel. So what we learn in Judaism is the very thing you're doing on a physical level, you're looking in drawers and cleaning them out, is what you're doing in your heart. You're looking in and you're seeing like what in me needs to be cleansed or purified or made whole again. So in Jewish thought, getting rid of the chametz has an internal component, right? And so we're going to see what that internal component here is on the next page in source 20. A lovely prayer that was said by one of the rabbis of the Talmud, so talking about around 1600 years ago, named Rabbi Alexandri, like Alexander. The Talmud tells us Rabbi Alexandri would say the following. And his prayer was about, how do I get stuck? And I pray for you to help me get unstuck. That's essentially what he's praying. So he says, Master of the universe, it's revealed and known before you that our will is to perform your will. And what prevents us? In other words, why can't I do that? And he gives two reasons. And the reasons will seem a bit obscure at first, so we're going to have to sort of analyze them. On the one hand, the yeast in the dough. So it turns out that the yeast in the dough is a symbol or a metaphor for the evil inclination in every person. That part of you that doesn't take you in the direction you want to go. That's one thing that stops us. And the subjugation to the kingdoms on the other, in other words, if there's any external oppression. So he prays, may be your will that you deliver us from the hands of both of these things. So may return to perform the edicts of your will with a perfect heart. So Rabbi Alexander in his world says, I'd like to perform my devotion to you, Lord, but I'm stopped both inside and outside. Help free me from these inside and outside, these internal and external constraints. So what does the yeast in the dough mean, right? This very cryptic phrase, right? This is the chametz. So Rashi says this amazing thing. He says the yeast in the dough is the yetzer hara, the inclination which causes us to miss opportunities. So it turns out that the yeast in the dough, in some ways, is none other than procrastination. Not living the life you want at the moment the opportunity comes up. Saying, I'll do it tomorrow. Saying, I don't have to take care of it now. Somebody comes along and they're really special and you just sort of let it drift. And then years later, you think, I didn't take up the opportunity. So part of freedom is recognizing, now let's connect all the dots, right? 400 years the Jews are enslaved. They come out of Egypt, they eat matzah. The Haggadah, pay attention to this in the Pesach, Matzah, and Maro section, right before, right? We talked about this before, that section right before you eat. And what does it say for matzah? It says, because they did not have time for the dough to rise. Now think about this, because it's actually super strange. You're enslaved for 400 years. It takes 18 minutes for dough to ferment, and you don't have time. 400 years, you can't wait another 18 minutes. So it's trying to tell you something about what it means to be stuck. And it's trying to tell you something about what it means to be unstuck. And the question that I asked, they couldn't wait 18 minutes. The answer is no, they couldn't. Because when something is really, really important, when something is crucial to your life, when something is significant, you don't wait. You don't wait 18 minutes. You don't wait 8 minutes, right? That's the yeast in the dough, right? The metaphor of the yeast in the dough, which is the metaphor of chametz, is you wait. You wait for this thing to rise. You wait, you wait, you wait, you wait. And then you waited too long. Matzah is like, let's go. That's what matzah is. When you eat matzah the night of the Seder, that's what I want you to think about. I want you to think, come on, man, let's go. Let's get on with it. I want to do this thing. I'm going to do it. Because that's what it is. That's why it's different than chametz, right? So what Rav Alexandria is saying is that can't wait for the dough to rise. That's what gets stuck. I don't know what it is for you. Everybody has a different thing in their life, different narrative, a different story. But on Pesach, we tell a new story. We tell a new narrative to ourselves. This is the narrative of matzah. I am not going to wait anymore. It could be anything. A person that you haven't spoken to that you keep saying you're going to phone. A class that you said, I'd really like to do that. A craft you want to take up, a hobby you want to take up, a place you want to go to, just a way you want to spend lunch. It could be anything, a book you want to read. And always you say to yourself, yeah, I'll get to it. When we clean out the chametz, that's what we do. We make a list to ourselves, this is what I want to do with my day, with my week, with my life. And the clock is ticking and I need to get on with it. And that's what it means to clear out that piece of me that keeps procrastinating. Another beautiful, and I'm going to sort of end in a few minutes, beautiful explanation that's given in source 22 near the bottom of page 5 from Rabbi Kari Olitsky in her book, Preparing Your Heart for Passover. So she has a different sort of metaphorical set of terms that she uses for chametz. Also really good. She says chametz is the baggage we carry from broken promises, failed relationships, personal disappointments. It's the residual stuff that emerges from poor decisions, mistake, and judgment. What do we do with this kind of chametz? Can we hide or sell it, right? You can't do that with the internal stuff. Right? You can do that with the physical stuff. Can we clean or burn this type of yeast? No. So she says clearing out internal chametz isn't easy. Often we resist. In her, I think she says something very true. She says, we don't want to let go of an old story or forgive someone who's hurt us or to believe that we ourselves can be forgiven for our missed marks. It requires some scrubbing, metaphysically speaking. Our work, right? This is the clearing out the chametz work, is discerning which of our old stories still serves us and which have become chametz that we need to shed or to move toward liberation. So it's also, how do you identify yourself? You know, I meet so many people who kind of put a label on themselves and then they're stuck in the label, you know. I'll ask them some completely innocuous, innocent Jewish question, and they'll say reflexively, I'm not religious. I'm thinking, I didn't ask you if you're religious. People, I've gotten that a lot in my life. People say, I'm not Orthodox. I say, I don't care what you're not. Tell me what you are. All of these negative identities that we stick ourselves with, right? That's what Karyolitsky means by a new narrative, is like we really enslave ourselves with these self-identifications and self-labels that we then communicate to other people. Like when you're talking to me, this is who you're talking to. You know, and part of the new narrative on Pesach is, okay, yeah, we all have kind of core identities, but maybe we've been a little too rigid in some of those identifications, and maybe we can let go of a few of them and say, and I think this business of negative self-identification is really toxic. Don't tell people what you're not. Talk about what's meaningful for you. Talk about what you are. Talk about what you dream of, not I'm not this. Right? That's part of what Rabbi Elliott means. That's what we need to shed on the road to liberation. And she concludes at the top of the next page. This love and this chametz also symbolizes a puffiness of self, an inflated personality, right? Literally talking about bread rising, and egocentricity that threatens to eclipse the essential personality of the individual. It's what prevents the individual from rising spiritually and moving closer to holiness, ironically, right? You have to get rid of the false rising in order to get to the true rising. In the end, every Jewish holiday, whether it's Shabbat, whether it's Pesach, whether it's Yom Kippur, is in many ways about time. How we spend our time, how time passes, how clued are we to the idea that time passes, how much do we want to live the life that we want, you know. So my last source, I've given you further reading, but that's for after the class. My last source is source 23, the first century writer Seneca, who was struck by the fact that people didn't seem to value their lives as they were living them. Everybody was really busy. Everybody wasted their time. And he says the following in the second paragraph of source 23. People are frugal in guarding their personal property, but as soon as it comes to squandering time, they're the most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be stingy. Life is long if you know how to use it, he counseled, right? So that's the most valuable resource we have, really, besides our relationship, is our time. And I've tried to indicate that guarding our time and guarding what we do with our time and guarding how we are addressed and so on is crucial as a step forward. So, you know, look, this hour has really been just a microcosmic look at a very, very rich event, which is the Seder and the Haggadah. But I want to, you know, impress upon you that there are real tools here that can be used for bit by bit by bit for our own spiritual liberation, and our own identification of where we're stuck and how we can get free. I told my kids since they were very, very little that the only person on earth that you control is yourself. So I think the first thing is, and it's a hard thing, because especially when you're younger and you're adolescent, there's a culture of comparison. People are really insecure because they're always thinking about themselves in relation to others. And there's nothing you can do about that. You can't, like, you know, necessarily convince people of the truths that you know, but you can talk about it. You can just talk about the fact that in the end, we don't really control other people, but that it's an amazing thing at any given moment if you're able to respond and do no harm. That's one thing. Just say, like, think of every situation you're in. If you come out of it having not done harm, you've left it a better situation than you started, right? So whether it's with their friends or with their siblings or with their parents, you just keep repeating the same mantra, which is the idea that you can't control other people, try not to harm other people, try and do the right thing, not just because it's the right thing, because in the end, you will feel better in the long run. They may not listen right away and they may not take, but if you're consistent in that message, basically people catch up to that message as they get older. Sometimes it takes a certain amount of heartache, right? A certain amount of frustration and pain. But I do find that people do catch up to that. You know, if you remain solid and consistent with that, because in a way they're looking to you for that. Even if they foist it off, even if they seem to reject it, they internally and unconsciously, they know, you know, when I talk to her, I know that's what I'm going to get. And in a very sneaky way, they actually rely on it, even if they may not absorb it right away. The first thing is that actually the redemption came second. The first thing that happened, which is something that happened before the Exodus, that's narrated in the book of Exodus, and is actually a key moment in Israelite history, is that God commands the Israelites 5 days before the Exodus to take a lamb, because the lamb was one of the deities of Egypt, to take it through the streets, to take it home, to guard it for 4 days, and then to slaughter it as a Paschal lamb offering on the morning prior to the Seder, or in their case, prior to the actual Exodus. Symbology of that cannot be overstated, because what God was saying to them is, I need to see that you're invested in a new story, in a new identity, and then I can redeem you. Because I'm not going to redeem you if you're not at least interested in that redemption. So there is a kind of reciprocal interaction that takes place in the Exodus narrative, where the Israelites, who obviously don't have a lot of agency and don't have a lot of emotional energy to spare, but he's saying, I just want to see something from you, something that indicates that you are, if not excited, then at least rising to the notion that there can be another life, a new life. You've probably seen that with people you know. It is very, very hard to get anybody to change or make a difference unless they themselves first have some glimmer or really fierce desire to be in a different spot, right? Otherwise, it's like dragging kind of dead weight. That's the first thing. The second thing, like from my personal point of view, is like there's a lovely quote by one of the leaders of the 19th century Musar movement, which is a kind of ethics movement in Judaism, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who, commenting on people's material acquisitiveness and yet proselytizing to their neighbors, said, let's reverse that. You take care of your own soul and you worry about your neighbor's stomach. That's basically how I think about life. You know, God will take care of whatever God will take care of. It's not my brief, and I'm not going to sit around worrying about what God's doing. There's plenty of work on earth. My work is to be the best person I can be, and can I be of help to my neighbor? And that's how I think about redemption.